Hi guys, this is Miss Bridget, and I have another video for you today. I've got a story that we're going to read. If you remember the last lesson that we talked about a myth, and we said that a myth is a kind of story that is made up, and it usually has animal characters that act like people. They usually talk, and they might wear clothes like people, they might drive a car, they do things that people would do. Another important thing about a myth is that a myth tries to explain how things are or why things are the way they are. Some of the things that we talked about last time was maybe why a zebra has black stripes or how the giraffe got its long neck. Those are some examples of myths that were told in various stories by different people. Another thing about a myth is that it teaches us a lesson, or it has a moral at the end for us to learn. So we can learn things by reading a myth. In the last lesson, in the last video, I talked to you about the plant myths, and we said there were 3 of them in our book, and I have them up here on our board. The first plant myth that we read about was the 4-leaf clover. We said that a lot of people think that a 4-leaf clover shows good luck. So if you find a 4-leaf clover, it brings good luck. Another myth was the dandelion plant. Remember, the dandelion plant was the one that you blow and the seeds scatter in the wind. If you make a wish, a lot of people believe that your wish will come true. And the last one that we talked about was the bluebell plant. Remember, it had the pretty blue flowers. And people told that if you touch a bluebell plant, bad things would happen or it would bring bad luck. So they warned people not to touch a bluebell plant, just to leave it alone. You know, these are all fun stories for us to think about, but they're not necessarily true. They're a myth. And remember that a myth is just a story, a made-up story that someone has told. Usually, people try to entertain themselves a long time ago by making up things. If they didn't know the answer to something, ancient people long ago would make up stories about different things to try to explain how things are or why things came to be a certain way. So you're going to see lots of different kinds of myths that come from different countries all around the world. And this was a way that people would entertain themselves. You know, a long time ago, there was no TV and there was no video games. So people would sit around and think of ways to entertain themselves. And one of the things they would do is share stories. And these stories would be told by word of mouth, and they would be passed down from one generation to another. One person would tell their children, and then their children would tell their children, and those children would tell their children, and on it would continue. And so long ago, ancient people would make up myths, and they would tell them to try to explain why things are or how things came to be. And so these stories come in lots of different versions, and that's why, is because lots of different people had told the story, and over time it may have changed a little bit. So today we're going to look at a story, and it's called The Golden Flower, and this is in your large reading book, and it's on page 486. And again, it tells us at the top of the page the genre. The genre is the kind of story that we'll be reading, and the genre of this story is a myth. And I can see that the golden flower is a myth from Puerto Rico. So this story was told by ancient people in Puerto Rico. And so one of the questions that we talked about in the last video was why myths are important. What do myths help us to understand? And so one of the things we talked about last time was that myths help us to understand a lot of things. What are you thinking? What do you remember about a myth? What does a myth help us to understand? Well, one thing that myths help us to understand is how things came to be, or they help to teach us a lesson. If you remember in the last story about the fir tree wanted to know why he was different. He didn't lose his leaves. Remember, he was an evergreen tree and he kept his green leaves year round. His friends, the oak and the elm tree, their leaves changed colors and they fell off and they were bare in the winter. And the fir tree was kind of jealous. He wanted to be like everyone else and he didn't understand why he was different. And if you remember, the lesson that he learned was that he had a purpose. There's a reason he was supposed to keep his leaves. And remember, there was animals that needed his tree and his leaves for shelter in the winter. And when he figured out what his purpose was, he was proud to be himself. And so one of the things the author wanted us to learn from that story was that we should be proud of who we are. And we should be happy that we're different because that makes us special. And so just like the fir tree was different, we're all different. And so a myth can be a kind of funny or a silly story sometimes. But in the end, if we really think about how we can relate to that story, the author usually has a lesson. And so when I think about how myths help us, or what myths help us understand, I think about the lesson that I can learn and how the author wants to teach us something in a myth. So it's a pretty important story if we think about it that way. So today we're going to listen to The Golden Flower. Like I said, it's in your large reading book. It's on page 486 if you want to follow along. As I look through this story, I can already tell, if I take a picture walk, I can already tell that the pictures in this story don't particularly look like real pictures. So I can already tell this is not going to be a true story. And I see the ancient people, so I can tell that this happened long ago. And I can predict that it's going to be about their history or something that they have figured out. Okay? So let's read and see what lesson we're going to learn or what moral we're going to learn from this story. Are you ready? The Golden Flower. In the beginning of the world, there was no water anywhere on earth. There was only a tall mountain that stood alone on a wide desert plain. There were no green plants. There were no flowers. All the people lived on top of this mountain. One day, a child went walking on the dry land below the mountain. As he bent over the ground looking for food, something floated by on the wind. He reached out and caught it in his hand. It was a seed, a small brown seed. He put the seed into his pouch. The next day, he went walking and again found something as it floated by on the wind. It was another seed. Day by day, he gathered these seeds until his pouch was full. It could not hold any more. And the child said to himself, I will plant these seeds at the top of our mountain. He planted the seeds and waited. One morning, a tiny green leaf appeared. The child watched. From under the ground, a forest began to grow high on the top of the mountain. All the people came to see. It was a forest of many colored flowers, a magic garden of green leaves and thick branches. The child was happy. In the middle of the forest, at the foot of the tallest tree, there grew a vine that wrapped itself around the tree. And from that vine there grew a flower more beautiful than all the rest. A bright flower with golden petals. See how pretty? Let's stop right here and think for just a minute. What happened after the child planted the seeds? What are you thinking? What do you remember about after the child planted their seeds? What happened? Well, let's go back and reread to check for our understanding. Right here it says, He planted the seeds and waited. I bet that was hard to do. You know, in the last story in the fir tree, I remember Mother Nature telling him something very important. He was impatient and she kept telling him, remember that repetition? Those things that were repeated in the story? Every time he would ask her a question, she would say what? Be patient. It takes a lot of patience to grow plants because they take a long time, don't they? So he waited and watched. It says, one morning a tiny green leaf appeared. The child watched. So from under the ground, a forest began to grow. And so as he watched, he waited and he watched. And it took a long time, but he was patient too, wasn't he? And from that flower, something new appeared in the forest. It looked like a little ball. Look, cried the child, something is growing out of the flower. That reminds me of when we plant a garden and when a vine grows and flowers grow on that vine, in that place of that flower where the seeds are in that flower, a fruit starts to grow. And so we have watermelons that grow from there. Sometimes it might be a vegetable like a squash, or a pumpkin can grow in that spot. So that reminds me of planting our garden and how our flower can turn into a fruit or a vegetable. As the people gathered around to watch, the ball grew larger and larger until it became a great yellow globe that shone like the sun. Even as they walked on the dry land far below, people could see it shining on top of the mountain. One woman said, if you put your ear next to the ball, you can hear strange noises coming from inside. The people listened. Strange sounds and murmuring could be heard, but nobody knew what was hidden inside. The people were afraid. After that, they all stayed away. Even the child stayed away. What are you thinking that's inside the ball? If you had been these people, would you have stayed away? Would you have been afraid? I probably would have been curious and I would have stuck around and watched it. See what was happening. One day, a man walked on the desert plain and saw the golden ball. He said, if that shining ball were mine, I would have the power of the sun. I could light up the sky or make darkness fall. And he ran toward it, climbing up the rocky mountainside. On the other side of the mountain, another man saw the shining globe, and he also said, I want that thing for myself. It will give me great powers. He too began to run. Each one climbed quickly. Each one found a footpath that led to the tree. This doesn't sound very good to me. They're both after the same thing, aren't they? And they're both looking for power. I don't think that that's going to end well, do you? They both ran without stopping until they reached the shining globe at the same time. But what they found was not really a ball. It was the fruit of the golden flower, a calabaza, a pumpkin. The two men began to fight and argue. It is mine, said one. No, it is mine, said the other. Each man grabbed the pumpkin. They pushed and pulled. They pulled and tugged until finally the vine broke. The pumpkin began to roll down the mountain faster and faster until it crashed into a sharp rock and burst apart. What's coming out? Look at it. Flowing out. Whoosh! Waves of water poured out of the pumpkin. The water bubbled and foamed. The waves began to cover the earth, flooding the desert plain, rising higher and higher. For it was the sea that had been hidden inside the pumpkin. Out came the creatures, whales, dolphins, crabs, and sunfish. All the people ran to the top of the mountain to hide in the forest of green leaves. That's what noises that we were hearing, or that they were hearing inside the pumpkin. Do you remember how they said they could listen and hold their ear to the pumpkin? They could hear noises coming from inside, and it had scared them away. But it was really all the sea creatures inside. Let's make some predictions here. Let's stop and think about what's happened so far. What do you think will happen after the people run to the top of the mountain? What do you think they'll do? You know, they didn't have any water before. And now that the pumpkin has broken open and all this water has flooded down below, now they have water. What do you think will happen next? Do you think that they'll enjoy their water, or do you think that they won't like it? What do you think? Let's see what happens to those two men that were fighting too. Will the whole earth be covered? They cried. Oh, they're worried about a flood. Higher and higher, the waters kept rising up the sides of the mountain. But when the water reached the edge of the magic forest that the little boy had planted, it stopped. The people peeked out from behind the leaves. And what did they see? Small streams running through the trees, a beach of golden sand, and the wide open ocean sparkling all around them. Now the people could drink from the cool streams, and they could splash in the rippling waves. Now they could gather fish from the flowing tides and plant their crops. The child laughed and sang as the sun shone down and breezes blew through the green leaves and rustled the many-colored flowers. Water had came to the earth. And that is how the Taino say, between the sun and the sparkling blue sea, that their island home, Borquin, came to be. So this story tells us the story of how their town came to be. What does this myth help us to understand about pumpkin plants? What are you thinking? What do you think the author wanted us to learn about pumpkin plants from this story? That's right. I'm thinking about some of our vocabulary words, and I'm thinking about one of the words, develop, and how when a seed grows, it starts to change and develop, and it goes through stages. If you remember back in the fall when we did our pumpkin math, we talked about the life cycle of a pumpkin. And we talked about how a life cycle are the stages of how something grows and develops, how it changes over time. And it's shaped in a circle pattern because that cycle happens over and over and over again. Think about how this all began. It started with some small seeds. And the little boy planted them, and it grew into a vine. And then on the vine grew a flower. And on that flower, the flower began to close up and grow the fruit that was there. And it grew the pumpkin. And the pumpkin got so large that it began to spill out all of these things on the inside. Now we know that a real pumpkin will not spill out water and sea creatures. But this was a fun way for this author to show us how a pumpkin plant grows and develops. It was also a good way for us to see how the little boy helped his village. What would have happened to the village and the people if the little boy hadn't planted those seeds that he collected? Think about that for just a minute. He collected all those seeds and put them in his pouch. And then he went up to the top of the mountain and planted those seeds. And from those seeds grew this beautiful forest. And they were able to climb up that mountain and live there. Another thing that come from his seed was the pumpkin, which held the water. And when the water began to rise up and cover the bottom, they would not have had anywhere to live if he hadn't have planted that forest up on top for them to live in. And the water was down below. So because the little boy worked hard and planted those seeds, they were able to enjoy what came from the seeds. And he worked together with the people that lived there. Now, the men that were fighting over the plant, I don't think they worked together very well, did they? You know, we can think about them being selfish because they both wanted that for themselves. The little boy, if he had been selfish, he would have kept those seeds all to himself, wouldn't he? But he wasn't. He went and planted them, and then the village was able to have the plants there to share. So I think this author was trying to teach us lots of things. You know, we learned about the life cycle of a pumpkin plant and how it grows and develops. We also learned that it's important to be generous and help others and not be selfish and keep things for ourselves. On the next page, I have an expository text here that shows us the parts of a pumpkin plant and how it grows. And so we see that a pumpkin starts out as a small seed. And so here it tells you the steps of how to plant a pumpkin. You plant seeds in a sunny place and you get a sprout. And after the sprout, the vine begins to grow. Look, there's the roots, the leaves, the flowers, and then there's the pumpkin. And inside the pumpkin are more seeds for it to start all over again. So pumpkins are, you know, a familiar thing that we see in the fall. Some people decorate them, some people bake them, some people make pumpkin pie, some people eat the seeds. You know, as we think about how a pumpkin grows and develops, it goes through certain stages and it changes. And one important thing we could call that is a life cycle. So this is a pretty amazing process. There it shows you the inside of a pumpkin. And then it shows you the seed and the seed parts. So this week we've learned a lot of things. We've learned about a myth. Remember that a myth tells us how or why something came to be. It's a story that's made up, and it has animal characters that usually take on human characteristics. They usually talk or walk, do things like people. And it teaches us a lesson, or it has a moral at the end. You know, I learned that it's very important that we're proud of who we are and that we help each other. And I think those are two very important lessons we could learn this week. And I hope you learned a lot too. And remember, this is going to be our last video this week, so I want you to work hard and do the rest of the lessons on Google Classroom and finish that up. Remember that when you're finished with your books, with your reading books, when you're finished with those, you can turn those in at the school. If you go by the school at the times that they have the lunches ready, I think it's 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, you can drop your books off there and just tell them that they're for Miss Bridget Harris's class, and they'll put them in our rooms for us. And you can turn those in there. We've already turned in our library books, so you're all finished with that. And so we just have to turn these in as you finish them at the end of the week, okay? I hope you have a good rest of the summer. I hope I get to see you again. And I wish you all the best of luck. Next year, I'm going to try to bring you a little end of the year treat around. And I'll be talking to your parents about that a little bit later. I miss you guys, and I hope you're doing well. And I can't wait to see you again. I'll see you later. Bye.